Hey guys, it's Katie, and I'm here today to talk about representation in books. You guys don't know already, a lot of us in the community want more representation and we want good representation. And you might be thinking, didn't you do something kind of contrary ish to this a couple of months back? And I'm going to say yes and no. I talked about other sides and just not going after the authors and nitpicking every tiny little thing by saying you didn't like something because of this one word or this one phrase or this one scene. This discussion is all about the actual representation as a whole in books. And I'm mostly going to focus on specific types of representation because they're something that I don't see as much in books that I would personally like to see more of. But in general, I'm going to talk about just representation, period. I mean, one thing that we can all agree on as a community is that we all want more representation and more diversity in the books that we read. Whether it's fantasy or contemporaries, you name it, we want good representation. And the thing about that is, even when we get the representation that we so desperately want, some people take issue with the way that things are represented. And I'm not here to say that there's anything wrong with that because everyone is going to have a different experience and everyone's experience is definitely something that is okay. We don't all have the same experiences, we don't all have the same thoughts or values as other people do, and so we can all bring something to the table and have a really good, productive discussion about it. So that's kind of what I was getting at in my other video, is just we shouldn't attack other people because of the way that they've written something or the way that they are expressing their dislike, but we can do it in a more productive way rather than just ranting and getting pissed off about it. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about the types of representation that we do get to see. In the last several years, we've gotten to see quite a bit of LGBT rep, and that's great. That's something that we all need more of, and I still am a supporter of seeing that in books. I mean, even though it might not be portrayed in the best way, at least we're starting to make steps to getting towards the type of representation we want. And I mean, there's a lot of coming out stories, and that is great. And there are even some that are more adult-like that I've started to see that have come out of the woodworks. It all seems to be romance-based, and I'd like to see some other types of LGBT rep without the romance side thrown in, if you know what I mean. Another type of representation that I feel like we're starting to maybe get to see a little bit more in our books is mental health rep. A mental health rep is something that I've heard a lot about in books, but it is portrayed in negative ways. And that's something that's, once again, something that at least it's being represented and it's starting to be talked about. And I think that even if we get it in a negative light, it still has value. It's still getting people thinking and it's still getting people talking about it. I mean, we have whole communities or whole sub-communities and people here on BookTube that dedicate certain events to mental health and mental health awareness, and that's great and fantastic. But the thing that we don't have control of is the types of books that get put out unless we write them ourselves. And I know that there are people out there that are working on that, and that's great too. But it's something that is still being portrayed and still something that is being done in some way, shape, or form. And I'm sure there are some books out there that portray it differently than I'm explaining. But based off of what I've been hearing and the things that I've been seeing, it's not being portrayed well. But that brings me to another point of going back to everyone's experiences are different. There can be disagreements with people who fall into these specific categories. You know, using an example, so one person who has anxiety could read a book and really think the representation is good, whereas another person who has the same situation, falls into the same kind of categories, may think the representation is terrible and that it's damaging. And there's always going to be that kind of a situation. And ultimately, I think it comes down to what do we personally feel, and also just talking to people who fall into those categories and getting their take on it. but also talking to people who are outside of it and getting their take on it too. I mean, it's not like the only people's opinions who matter are the people who are being represented in some ways. And I'll give you a personal example in a few minutes when I get there, but I'm just starting it by saying, everyone's experiences, whether they've had this thing or not, are important. It's important to get many different perspectives and just start that conversation, because by starting those conversations and having those conversations, it can make people aware of a different perspective that they didn't realize existed, that they might have had a misconception about before they launched in, for instance. And it's those kinds of conversations that can really start to get us to where we want to be and where we want to go in terms of the representation that we see. Because as I said, one person might think one way and one person might think another way, and we have no control over how someone is going to react. But those are some examples of certain types of representation that I've heard of or seen quite a bit of in books. But I want to change the subject a little bit and talk about a specific group that I don't see represented in books very often, and if they do, they're typically stereotyped or there's all this stigma surrounding it. And that is people with disabilities, whether it's learning disabilities, physical disabilities, you name it. It's not something that I see as being represented or represented well in books. And as someone who falls into that category in many, many, many facets of my life, it's something that I'd like to see more of. And recently, actually, I stumbled across this kind of discussion about Harry Potter and how a lot of people don't see Harry Potter as being diverse. And I'm here to kind of maybe insert a few things into it. And while I agree on the most part, there are many, many ways of being diverse. For instance, Neville is perceived as having disabilities, primarily learning disabilities. And it took me quite a while to figure that out, but once I did, it just completely changed my life and changed my perception of him as a character. And that is a form of diversity, having someone who is disabled. But also they talked at length about class systems, and that's something that is still pervasive in our society today and could be seen as, in some form, a form of diversity. Lower income classes versus high income classes, and just how they perceive each other and how they interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. And as I said, in some ways that could be perceived as a financial diversity situation. I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but that's something that I saw a lot of in Harry Potter as well. And I mean, things like that, just getting to see things like that, little things that might not be overt, it can still be construed that way. And I don't know, I really enjoyed the representation that we got through Neville. It's not shown in a positive light per se, because everyone was making fun of him and telling him he's stupid and asking him why he's there. Well, those are all experiences that I myself have experienced, and that alone makes it good representation to me, because that is something that real people with those kinds of disabilities or those kinds of everyday struggles go through. And seeing someone like me going through a similar situation that I've been going through is enough for me to feel like I am being seen, if you know what I mean. Switching gears a little bit, enough talking about Harry Potter and disabilities, it's just something that I'd like to see more of, and I'd like to see it become as overt as something as the LGBT rep. Whether it's negative or positive, I want to see more of it. And that brings me to another type of representation that I'd like to see more of, and that is cultural representation. I'd like to see more Black fantasy. I'd love to see more Asian fantasy. I mean, we have a little bit of it through, Children of Blood and Bone and Ken Liu's series, The Dandelion Dynasty, Dandelion something. And again, I'd like to see more of it. There are only so many that we've gotten so far, and it's something that I'd like to see more of. And once again, at the same time, just because there's representation doesn't mean it's good representation. I was watching one of my fellow booktubers. She was reading a book, I think it was either earlier this year or late last year, Asian representation in fantasy. And she ultimately had to put the book down because of all of the derogatory slurs that were being used and all of the negative connotations of things. It was more of a cultural appropriation situation than it was actual like fantasy based world around that culture and that society. And I can understand where she was coming from in relation to that. As I said, once again, everyone's experiences are different, but it seemed like more people who were Asian were taking offense to the things that were being written, especially since it was not own voices, but also just because of the things that were being used and portrayed in the book. And ultimately, they had to put it down and just could not continue with it because they found it so highly offensive. And the same can be said for other cultural representation as well. I mean, despite the fact that I am a white person, I read a fantasy-based novel in a culture that is very similar to something that I actually am. And I found the representation and portrayal of it all to be absolutely awful and despicable, and it made me hate the book more than I already was in the first place. And if you don't know what I'm talking about the Grisha trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. I did a whole review about this, and I did a whole discussion about my feelings on it, not only from the actual story standpoint, but also from the representation standpoint. And because it's not a minority culture, I don't feel comfortable using the term cultural appropriation, but it is something very, very similar to that. What Leigh Bardugo did was take certain aspects of Russian and Slavic culture and life and language and just bastardized it for her own entertainment and turned it into something else. And I'm watching a lot of people out there talk about how unique and how unusual and exciting it all is because it's never been done before. And I'm just sitting there feeling very offended and very irritated and frankly angry because of how a culture that I am, my background, is being completely destroyed before my eyes. It's not just cultures like African American, Native American, Latinx, and Asian that are being destroyed and bastardized, but it is also certain quote white cultures as well. And I'm not here to argue that point. I'm just telling you about my experience because the Grisha trilogy, while it is a fantasy series, it is a Russian-based fantasy. But really what she did was just take bits and pieces that she liked, bastardize them, and made them her own for her own enjoyment. And that's not okay, no matter which culture you are doing it with. I mean, I've started to notice it more with no matter what kind of fantasy or what kind of book I'm reading, I've become more in tune with the cultural aspects of the books that I'm reading. Just kind of set them aside or just kind of have them be okay. It's something that I've become kind of more hyper aware of. Definitely changed my perspective on things and made me a little bit more critical and nervous about the whole process in some ways. And because I've become more hyper aware of it, it's become a little bit more frustrating to me. So I'm becoming a little bit more picky about what I read when it comes to things like that. But on the other hand, talking about Russian and Slavic culture and whatnot, one book series that has done a really, really good job of making a fantasy-based world in Russian, Slavic period of time, is the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. And once again, Wallace not own voices. She got her master's degree, I believe, or PhD in Russian literature, along with something else, and Russian history, and she lived in Russia for a period of time and really got to know the people and got to know the culture and just kind of immersed herself in it. And therefore, she was more qualified to write something about that than Leigh Bardugo was. She clearly did her research. She created this incredible world and these incredible characters and this beautiful story using certain aspects of Russian culture, literature, life. She made something magical out of it while keeping it to its core. Whereas with Leigh Bardugo, she didn't do that. Or at least she didn't express it well enough in a way that I enjoyed it. So, I mean, it's tricky when it comes to different cultures and you're writing, a book about it, whether it's fantasy or contemporary, to keep it true to itself so you don't offend an entire culture. And I don't know, maybe I'm on my soapbox too much, but it's something that I'd like to see more, because we've seen clearly it can be done well through research and detailed efforts and actually caring about the thing that you're writing, rather than just being like, oh, this hasn't been done before, let's take this and throw it in a fantasy setting or throw it in a sci-fi setting. You need to be a little bit more aware of it. And I mean, really what I'm just trying to get at is just to distill everything that I've said from this whole conversation is, just because there's representation does not mean it is necessarily good representation. But also, just because there's representation doesn't mean that two different people from that same marginalized group can't have different experiences and thoughts and feelings on it. It can open up our minds and open up so many things for discussion and just getting different perspectives from different people. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about the bookish community. We are more diverse than we realize, and yes, we need to be more inclusive in that diversity. Shouldn't be afraid to listen to other people's opinions and experiences on something just because you had a different opinion from them. It doesn't mean that their experience is any less important than yours was. And so, I mean, just talking to each other and getting these different perspectives and working towards striving to be in a better place and have that better representation. It's important that we have these conversations, but we have them in a respectful way. I mean, yes, you're allowed to have those emotions, but really sit back, take a deep breath, calm yourself, and then begin having that conversation in a calm, rational way. Because by attacking people and going after other people, you're just not going to necessarily get the response that you want. The author or the creator or the reader is going to get defensive, and that's not healthy for anyone. So basically, just to recap my whole thoughts, feelings on this whole thing, just because there's representation doesn't mean that it's good representation. People within the same marginalized communities can have differing opinions and open up conversations in different avenues to give a larger audience a different perspective on things. And we are able to have these conversations in a rational, calm way. Attacking someone isn't going to get you to the goal and to the representation road that we want to be on. But I'd be interested to hear what some other people have to think about this topic and about maybe a specific community that they identify with and their representation experiences in books. Definitely feel free to leave comments down below or reach out to me on social media and we can talk further about it. But other than that, you guys know the drill. I have a Twitter, which is @ASeaofTones, which is the same as my handle here. And I also have a Goodreads where you guys can go over there and see what I've been reading, check out my progress, and see my general thoughts on things before I come scream at you about it over here. But other than that, I'll catch you later with another video for you guys again soon. Bye!